Renata Silva, at her 43 years, knew the smell of wax and disinfectant much better than that of any imported perfume. As she slid the mop across the mirrored floor of the Sousa and Associados conglomerate, her mind travelled to a past that seemed to belong to another woman, a version of herself that the world had forgotten. A woman who taught about the complexity of Slavic languages at a renowned federal university, whose hands, now rough and scarred by bleach, had once translated secret diplomatic agreements for the Hungarian consulate. But honesty had come at too high a price. Denouncing a corruption scheme put her on an invisible list that closed all academic and governmental doors. Now, the only contract that mattered was the one for the health plan that guaranteed insulin and glucose strips for Beatrice, her 10-year-old daughter, whose smile was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Each repetitive movement of the mop was a silent prayer for her daughter's health, a sacrifice swallowed dry and hidden under the grey uniform and the deliberately low gaze. On the other side of that universe of glass and steel was Danilo Sousa, the owner of it all. A 42-year-old man sculpted in expensive suits and an arrogance that arrived even before he entered the room. To him, Renata was less than a person. She was a function, a grey figure that moved in the corners to erase the traces of the day. That morning, he passed by her with the haste of someone dodging a traffic cone, his mind buzzing with figures, contracts, and the imminent arrival of a foreign delegation that could yield millions. He never noticed her eyes, which for a second lifted and carried the weight of an entire library. For Danilo, the world was divided into two categories: people who could bring him more money, and the rest. The cleaning lady, with her bucket and her silence, categorically belonged to the rest, an invisible being in his empire of success. He had no idea, and wouldn't bother to imagine, that the woman who dusted his mahogany desk could alone decipher the secrets of entire nations. The forced tranquility of Renata's routine was shattered by a wave of panic that was not hers, but that spread through the floor like a fire. It all started with the arrival of a brown envelope, with strange stamps and a crest that she recognized immediately, making her heart give a painful leap of nostalgia and apprehension. They were documents from Hungary. She saw when Danilo's secretary, a young woman named Carla, always trembling with fear, handed them to her boss. The glass door closed, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Soon, the door opened abruptly, and Danilo's face, normally a mask of cold control, was congested with an impotent fury. He barked orders, demanding a translator. "Hungarian! I need someone who reads Hungarian for yesterday," his voice echoed across the expensive carpet. Renata, who was cleaning the blinds of a distant window, felt the weight of that word like a blow. Hungarian, the language she mastered like her own, the complex melody of her golden years. She watched, motionless, as assistants ran, phones were dialed in desperation, and renowned translation agencies gave negative answers. "The deadline is 24 hours. Impossible. We don't have anyone available with this urgency." Each refusal increased the pressure in the environment, and the air seemed thin, heavy with the fear of Danilo's imminent fury. Danilo's frustration reached a boiling point. He, the man who bought solutions, who bent the world with his checkbook, was being defeated by a pile of paper and a language that sounded like an insult. His team, his well-paid executives, his influential contacts all proved useless. It was a personal affront, a crack in his armor of omnipotence. He stormed out of his office like a bull, his face red, the papers crumpled in his hand. He stopped in the center of the office, and the silence became absolute, heavy, with dozens of eyes fixed on him. Then, in a gesture of pure contempt and disdain for both his team and the problem itself, he held the documents in the air. "You know what? Screw it," he shouted, his voice resonating with a dangerous vibration. "I'll pay my month's salary, 45,000 rees. I'll give 45,000 reis to whoever is in this room and deciphers this crap now." A mixture of shock and nervous laughter ran through the room. It was an absurd offer, a theater of humiliation. It was at that moment that something inside Renata broke. She heard the amount, the language, and saw her daughter's face in her mind. The fear of public humiliation was immense, but the image of Beatrice's smile and the chance to give her a secure future were greater. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she dropped the cleaning cloth in the bucket, the sound echoing in the deadly silence, and took a step forward. All eyes, previously fixed on Danilo, turned to Renata. The sound of the cloth falling into the bucket was like a starting pistol for a race no one understood. A perplexed silence dominated the floor, followed by a murmur that spread like a plague. "Is it the cleaning lady? Has she gone crazy? How embarrassing!" The executives, once cowering in fear, now exchanged glances that mixed pity and mockery. To them, it was the height of absurdity. Danilo, for his part, felt a wave of fury so intense that his face paled before turning red. Again, the audacity, the insolence of that woman, that nothing. In his mind, this was a mockery, an attempt to ridicule him even further. He shot her a look, a cutting contempt in his eyes. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "I don't think you heard me right. I need a translator, not someone to clean up the mess I'm going to make if I don't solve this." He wanted to annihilate her with words, to send her back to her insignificance. But Renata, for the first time in 2 years, lifted her chin. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the image of Beatrice was stronger. "I heard you perfectly, Mr. Souza." Her voice sounded surprisingly firm, clear, without the tremor everyone expected. "You offered your salary to whoever translated the documents. I accept your offer." Her sentence hung in the air, a direct and undeniable challenge. The audience of employees held their breath. It was no longer madness, it was a confrontation. Danilo felt the ground disappear from under his feet for a fraction of a second. He, the all-powerful CEO, being put against the wall by the cleaning lady in front of his entire team. To back down now would be an admission of weakness, an even greater humiliation. Trapped in his own arrogant snare, he let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, really? The polyglot cleaning lady? That's a new one," he mocked, but the conviction in his voice wavered. With a theatrical gesture, he extended the papers towards her. "Well then, the stage is all yours. Surprise us." He expected her to stammer, to be intimidated and flee, but Renata walked the few meters that separated them with a dignity that her grey uniform could not hide. Her hands, which he only saw holding a squeegee, took the official documents with a delicacy and familiarity that were disconcerting. Her eyes, which he had never noticed, scanned the dense lines of Hungarian with a frightening speed and fluidity. A deep silence settled as she read the first page, then the second. Finally she raised her gaze, not to him, but to the horizon, as if organizing a universe of information in her mind. "Well," she began, and the voice that came out was not that of the cleaning lady. It was the voice of the professor. "To begin with, this is not a commercial contract, Mr. Souza. It is a legal notification from the District Court of Budapest, specifically from the probate division, and the deadline is not 24 hours. It expired yesterday." Those last words fell into the room with the weight of a death sentence. The deadline expired yesterday. The color drained from Danilo's face. The scorn, the mockery, all of it vanished, replaced by a mask of pure panic. A murmur of horror ran through the room. The fortune he didn't even know existed, lost before it was even known. But Renata continued, her voice an anchor of calm in the midst of the storm she herself had created. "The document states that, due to the lack of response to 3 previous notifications sent to an old address of yours, the court has initiated the process of declaring the inheritance vacant. It concerns the estate of a first-degree relative, an uncle on your mother's side, named Gabor Kovacs." Danilo frowned, the name sounding like a distant echo. a forgotten childhood memory of an uncle his mother mentioned in whispers who had stayed behind in Hungary. Mr. Kovacs passed away 18 months ago without leaving direct heirs, and you were named his sole beneficiary. The amount, after preliminary conversion and deduction of initial fees, is valued at approximately 15 million euros. 15 million euros. The figure exploded in the silence of the office, a number so astronomical it seemed like fiction. Danilo felt the air leave him, his legs weaken. He looked at the woman in front of him, at the grey uniform, at the serene face, and his brain simply couldn't connect her image with the information she had just delivered. The woman he considered less than dust was telling him that he was a millionaire in a currency worth 6 times his own, and that his own negligence had made him lose everything. The shock was collective. Jaws dropped. 15 million euros, the equivalent of almost 90 million reais. The amount hung in the air, surreal. Carla, the secretary, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. The executives looked at each other, envy and astonishment waging a battle on their faces. Renata's humiliation was forgotten. Now she was the bearer of a miracle, the prophetess of a lost fortune. Seeing Danilo's state of paralysis, Renata delivered the coup de grâce, not with cruelty, but with the precision of someone finally reclaiming her place. And by the way, Mr. Souza, regarding your question about the polyglot cleaning lady, she said, her voice still level, but with a thread of steel that no one there had ever heard. My name is Renata Silva. I have a PhD in Slavic philology from USP, with a specialization in Hungarian and Russian. I was a certified translator and official interpreter for the Hungarian consulate for 7 years, until I was forced to leave my career. She paused, letting each word settle in Danilo's stunned mind. The only reason I have been cleaning the floors of this company for the last 2 years is to pay for my daughter's health insurance. A plan that, with the prize you just promised me in public, will no longer be a problem. The checkmate. She not only proved her competence, but exposed the social wound, the injustice that had put her there. Danilo looked at her, but he no longer saw the cleaning lady. He saw an intellectual giant he had trampled on daily. His world had been turned upside down, and he knew with terrifying clarity that the only person on earth who could possibly save him was the woman he had despised the most. The silence that followed Renata's declaration was deeper and heavier than any before. It was the silence of the end, of a world, Danilo Souza's world. In his mind, a whirlwind of images from the last 2 years assaulted him with the violence of punches. Renata cleaning a coffee stain he had spilled, and for which he hadn't even thanked her. Renata shrinking to let him pass in the hallway. Renata with her gaze low, always low, as he passed by discussing million-dollar deals on the phone. Each memory was a stab to his pride, irrefutable proof of his own colossal stupidity. Arrogance, which had been his armor for his entire life, disintegrated, revealing a small, blind man. He wasn't a business genius. He was just a lucky man who didn't know how to recognize true value, even if he trampled it every day. With a superhuman effort, he turned to his audience of paralyzed employees. "What are you looking at? The show's over. Get back to work." His voice came out hoarse, flawed, devoid of its usual tyranny. It was the roar of a wounded lion. Then he turned to the woman who had dismantled him. He opened his mouth but didn't know what to call her. Dr. Mrs. Silva. Renata. The words stumbled, uncertain. Finally, he looked her in the eyes, the raw plea naked on his face. "In my office. Now. Please." The last word came out like a sigh, the sound of his unconditional surrender. Renata followed him, crossing the office that now seemed like a sea of shocked and curious faces. Upon entering his office, the sanctuary of his power, the atmosphere was different. There was no more oppression, only the desperate tension of a man on the edge of an abyss. He did not sit in his leather chair that looked like a throne. Instead, he gestured for her to sit in one of the client armchairs, a gesture of deference that would have been unthinkable an hour before. He began to pace, hands on his head, the expensive suit suddenly looking like an ill-fitting costume. "Tell me the truth," he pleaded, his voice low. "Is there any chance? Any at all? Or is it over?" Renata watched him for a moment, letting the weight of the question settle. She offered no easy comfort. Hungarian bureaucracy is a labyrinth, Mr. Sousa, and their judicial system is extremely formal. A missed deadline is, in practice, a closed door. Trying to reverse this with emails or calls from Brazil is the same as shouting against the wind. She paused, choosing her words with the care of a strategist. The only chance, and it's a remote chance, would be a personal appeal. To go to Budapest, file a petition to reopen the deadline, prove the reason for not receiving the notifications. It requires knowledge of local law, the language, and frankly, the right contacts in the right place. My old contacts at the consulate could be a start. She looked at him directly. This is no longer a translation. It's an international crisis consultation, and if you want my help, it will have a price. Besides the 45,000 you already owe me, I want 5% of the total amount recovered. No negotiation. Danilo heard Renata's proposal and, for a moment, the old arrogance tried to emerge, a conditioned reflex from a lifetime of power. 5%? Almost 4.5 million reais? The amount was obscene, audacious. His mind screamed no, but his survival instinct, now sharper than ever, screamed louder, "You have no choice, you idiot." He looked at her face, a face he barely knew, but which was now the map to his only path to salvation. There was no greed in her eyes, only a cold determination and unshakable justice. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was charging the price for a life of humiliation, of wasted talent, of sleepless nights worrying about her daughter's health. It was the price of her dignity, and in the depths of his newly exposed soul, he knew it was a fair price. The acceptance was a painful process, a capitulation that redefined his entire existence. He, who dictated the terms, now received them. He, who bought people, was being bought. With a slow, almost imperceptible nod, he agreed. "Deal," he murmured, the words sounding strange in his own mouth. 5% of whatever is recovered, and the 45,000. I'll have the legal department draw up a contract right now." Renata interrupted him with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about your legal department, Mr. Sousa. I'll draft our agreement myself, in Portuguese and in Hungarian, just to ensure there's no ambiguity." From that moment on, the power dynamic not only inverted, it was pulverized and rebuilt from scratch. Renata was no longer an employee. She was the commander of the operation. She sat in the armchair he had offered her, took a notepad from his desk, and began dictating orders with an efficiency that left Danilo astonished. "I need your passport and your mother's, if she's alive. I need a copy of your birth certificate and your parents' marriage certificate. I need any document that proves your relationship with Gabor Kovacs. While you get that, I'll call my contacts in Budapest and schedule a preliminary meeting with a lawyer specializing in international succession law. We need to be there in, at most, 72 hours. She spoke with the authority of someone who had navigated those turbulent waters dozens of times. Danilo, the man who commanded an empire, became a mere assistant, rushing to complete the tasks assigned to him. He called his secretary Carla, and his voice was different. "Carla, cancel my entire schedule for the rest of the week, and find my family's accountant's number. I need urgent documents." Carla, on the other end of the line, heard Renata's voice in the background, giving clear and precise instructions, and understood that a silent revolution had taken place. The world inside Sousa and Associados would never be the same. 48 hours later, reality felt like a fever dream. Renata was sitting in a first-class seat, the soft leather a stark contrast to the hard bus seats that had marked her last few years. Through the window, she saw the tarmac of the international airport, a portal to a world she thought she had lost forever. Beside her, in an awkward silence, was Danilo. For him, that VIP lounge, the welcome champagne, everything was routine. But for the first time in his life, he felt like an imposter in his own habitat. He watched Renata out of the corner of his eye. She didn't seem dazzled or out of place. On the contrary, there was a calmness and familiarity in her gestures that bothered and fascinated him at the same time. She had called her daughter Beatrice before boarding, and her face had transfigured into a softness he never imagined existed. "Mommy is going to take care of some work things, my love, and when I come back, we're going to celebrate a lot. Okay?" The work was saving his fortune. The celebration would be her freedom. Danilo swallowed hard, the crystal glass in his hand feeling heavy and vulgar. He, who had always seen himself at the top of the food chain, now realized he was just a noisy animal, while she was the true hunter, silent, intelligent, and lethal. As soon as the plane reached cruising altitude, the work dynamic resumed, but the office was now a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. Renata opened her briefcase, which contained not cleaning products, but copies of Hungarian laws, notes, and a laptop. Soon, she was on a satellite call, speaking fast, fluent Hungarian with a lawyer in Budapest. Danilo didn't understand a single word, but he understood everything. He saw the authority in her posture, the precision in her questions, the way she listened and countered arguments. It was a symphony of competence that left him completely excluded and at the same time mesmerized. He, who prided himself on his aggressive negotiations, realized his tactic was a club next to the surgical scalpel she wielded. His power came from money, hers from knowledge, something no one could take away. In a moment of pause, humility finally overcame shame. How do you manage to seem so calm?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. Renata looked at him, surprised by the genuine question. "Because for 7 years, Mr. Souza, my job was to be the only bridge of calm between two worlds that didn't understand each other. This is just one more bridge to build." The answer, without arrogance or rancor, was another piece of his old world that shattered. Landing in Budapest was like stepping through a mirror for Renata. The cold morning air, the melodic and complex sound of the Magyar language around her, the imposing architecture that held centuries of history. It was all a part of her she thought had died. As the taxi took them to the hotel, she found herself pointing to the chain bridge, to the majestic parliament on the banks of the Danube, not with the excitement of a tourist, but with the intimacy of someone reuniting with an old friend. For Danilo, it was an assault on the senses. He, used to landing in any capital of the world and dominating the environment with his English and his credit card, was mute and powerless. Every sign, every conversation, every gesture was a code he couldn't decipher. He depended on Renata for everything, to talk to the taxi driver, to check in at the hotel, to order a simple coffee. He watched her move through that world with a fluidity and confidence that bordered on royalty. She wasn't in her natural habitat. She was the natural habitat. The realization hit him hard. His power was a currency. Hers was the language itself. And there, in that ancient city, her currency was worth infinitely more. The meeting with Dr. Varga, the lawyer Renata had contacted, took place in an office that smelled of old books and beeswax. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes, a silent testament to generations of laws and litigation. Dr. Varga was an elderly man, with thick eyebrows and a gaze that seemed capable of dissecting souls. Initially, he addressed Danilo, the man in the expensive suit, assuming he was the main client. Renata, unfazed, responded in perfect Hungarian, explaining the situation with a clarity and legal precision that immediately made the old lawyer sit up straight in his chair. The meeting continued for over an hour, entirely in the local language. Danilo sat in absolute silence, feeling like a piece of furniture. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the universal language of competence. He saw Renata gesture, quote paragraphs from memory, her voice shifting from a conciliatory tone to one of unwavering firmness. He saw respect bloom on Dr. Varga's face, admiration replacing suspicion. In the end, Renata turned to him and translated, her voice calm as always. He said the case is a legally impenetrable fortress, but he has never seen anyone present the argument I suggested, using the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations as a basis to annul the notifications. He said it's audacious, bordering on madness, but it opened. A crack, a small sliver of light. We have a preliminary hearing in 2 days. The 2 days leading up to the hearing were an exercise in tension and strange calm. Budapest, with its melancholic beauty, became the backdrop for a silent transformation. One afternoon, while walking on Margaret Island, an oasis of peace in the middle of the Danube, Danilo finally broke the professional barrier that still separated them. The question came out almost as a whisper, laden with a hesitation he had never known. What was your life like before everything? Before me? He wasn't asking about the job, but about the soul of the woman he now saw. Renata stopped, watching the autumn leaves fall on the river. A sad, genuine smile touched her lips. It was noisy, she said, her voice full of a palpable nostalgia. The university was a chaos of ideas, debates, students challenging me. The consulate was a constant tension, the adrenaline of knowing that one mistranslated word could create a diplomatic incident. I loved the weight of responsibility, the feeling that my brain, my knowledge, was the most important tool in the room. I would come home exhausted, but alive. I felt I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As she spoke, she didn't look at him, but at a point on the horizon, as if she could see that other life floating on the river's waters. Danilo listened, and each of her words was one less brick in the wall of his ignorance, revealing the dimension of the cathedral he had helped, by omission and contempt, to leave in ruins. The weight of those words crushed him. The image of her, exhausted but alive, contrasted brutally with the image he had of the silent, exhausted cleaning lady, exhausted from exhaustion, not from purpose. The passion she described was something he, even with all his money, rarely felt. He felt the thrill of conquest, of power, but not that pure joy of the craft, of belonging. They stopped near one of the bridges, and he turned to her, his face a canvas of emotions he could no longer hide. "Renata," he began. His voice choked. "I need to say, I'm sorry, and I'm not talking about this inheritance or any of that. I'm sorry for every day, for every time I passed you in the hallway and didn't see you, for seeing you as a uniform, as an obstacle and not as a person. I prided myself on knowing how to judge people, and I was so blind, so arrogant. What I did, the way I treated you for 2 long years, was cruel. It was inhuman. And there's no justification for it. The confession came out all at once, a poison he needed to expel." Renata faced him, and for the first time, allowed the pain of those years to show in her eyes. A single silent tear rolled down her face, a tear for all that had been. She didn't offer easy forgiveness, but she offered something more valuable, a way forward. The past can't be erased, Danilo. It shapes us. What matters now is what we do with what we've become. The courtroom was an imposing hall, clad in dark wood that seemed to have absorbed centuries of sentences. The air was heavy with the gravity of the law. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern face and glasses that seemed to weigh on her nose, offered no glimpse of sympathy. On the other side, a young and ambitious state prosecutor presented the government's case with cold efficiency, arguing that deadlines are the backbone of justice, and that making an exception for a negligent foreigner would set a dangerous precedent. Danilo felt every word of his, even without understanding them, like a nail in his coffin. He was sweating cold, his hands locked in his lap. His entire life of control and power had been reduced to that moment of absolute impotence, a mute spectator at his own trial. His only hope rested on the woman beside him, the same woman he, for 2 years, hadn't even considered worthy of a good morning. He looked at her serene and focused profile, and prayed, not to a god he barely believed in, but to her competence, to the brilliant mind he had despised for so long. When the judge addressed her, inviting her to speak, Danilo held his breath, feeling his entire universe was about to be decided. Renata stood up, not with the posture of a cleaning lady, nor even a translator, but with the authority of a professor. She gave a respectful bow to the judge and began to speak. Her voice, calm and clear, filled the silence of the courtroom. She didn't just translate the facts. She wove a thesis. She argued that the case was not about the negligence of an individual, but about the responsibility of a state to communicate with citizens of another nation under the protection of international treaties. She cited the Vienna Convention, not as a suggestion, but as a higher law governing interactions between nations. Danilo saw the transformation on the judge's face. Severity gave way to intense intellectual curiosity. She leaned forward, absorbing every word. At one point, the judge interrupted her with a technical, complex and tricky question about consular jurisdiction. Renata answered instantly, with a depth that made even Dr. Varga, beside her, raise his eyebrows in admiration. After a silence that seemed to last an eternity, the judge removed her glasses and looked directly at Renata. In solemn Hungarian, she announced her decision. Dr. Varga translated in a whisper to Danilo. She said the argument is flawless, that the state failed in its consular duty. She is granting the petition. The case will be reopened. Danilo felt the ground return beneath his feet. A wave of relief so violent hit him that he had to hold onto the chair to keep from falling. He looked at Renata, who just closed her eyes for a second, breathing in deeply. It wasn't the euphoria of someone winning the lottery. It was the exhalation of someone who, finally, after a long and dark night, saw the sun rise. As they left the courthouse and were bathed in the Budapest sunlight, Danilo felt as if he were being born again, but in a completely different way. The relief for the recovered fortune was real, but it was a secondary feeling, a distant echo of a much larger and more overwhelming emotion that was taking over him. He walked beside Renata, no longer in front of her, and the silence between them was not of embarrassment, but of reverence. He, a man of easy words, of orders and speeches, was speechless. How do you thank someone for a miracle? How do you quantify gratitude for being saved from your own ruin? Not just financially, but morally. They stopped in the middle of the Liberty Bridge, with the Danube flowing lazily below. He turned to her, his eyes red with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. Renata, his voice was a thread. I'll never be able to thank you enough. And I'm not talking about the money. The money is just paper. You taught me a lesson that no fortune in the world could buy. You saved me from myself, from that blind and arrogant man I was. Thank you for not giving up when I most deserved for you to give up. He extended his hand, not for a business handshake, but as a plea for peace, for connection. Renata looked at his hand, and after a moment took it. A genuine smile, the first he had seen without the weight of sadness, lit up her face. We found the way, Danilo, both of us. The use of we sealed a pact that went far beyond any contract. The following days were a blur of bureaucratic activities, but the dynamic was different. They were partners. Under Renata's direction, they navigated private banks, notary offices and law firms. She was the general, and he, her most loyal lieutenant, executing tasks, signing where she pointed, learning to trust her judgment blindly. One afternoon, sitting in Dr. Varga's office to sign the final transfer, Danilo insisted on making 2 transactions before any other. The first was to Renata's account for the amount of 45,000 reais, the fulfillment of the original promise. The second was an international transfer of 1 million euros, an advance on her 5% commission. This is for you to start over. The rest will come as soon as the total amount is settled, he said with solemn seriousness. Seeing the confirmation of those transfers on Renata's face was, for him, more satisfying than seeing the millions enter his own account. Later, at the hotel, he heard her talking on the phone with her daughter. Her voice was pure melody, lullaby full of joy. "My love, I have a surprise. Remember that house with a big garden for us to have a dog? Well, Mommy will be able to buy it. Yes, my angel. And Mommy's old job? It's over. Forever." The flight back was a mirrored and inverted image of the trip there. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet and productive camaraderie. They didn't sit in silence. Instead, with the laptop open between them, they began to sketch out the future. Danilo, for the first time, spoke of his own company with brutal honesty, exposing its flaws, its predatory culture, and its lack of vision beyond immediate profit. He was no longer bragging about his empire. He was making a diagnosis. In the midst of this conversation, he stopped and looked at Renata, his expression serious, the idea forming in his mind like a revelation. "I don't just want to pay you and see you go, Renata," he said, his voice firm with a new kind of conviction. "That would be a waste, the biggest waste of my life. I want you to stay. I want you to help me change Sousa and Associados from the inside. I want to create a new arm in the company, a consultancy for international relations and geopolitical risk analysis. And I want you to be the president of that department. I want you to bring your ethics, your intelligence, and your vision to that place. I want you to teach me, and everyone there, to see people, not just numbers." The proposal hung in the air, much larger and more complex than any amount of money. It wasn't a job. It was an invitation to rebuild a kingdom. Their arrival at the office 2 days later was a seismic event. They entered together, side by side, talking in low voices about the plans for the new division. Heads turned. Keyboards fell silent. The entire floor froze. Carla, the secretary, let her jaw drop, her eyes darting from Danilo to the woman beside him, the same woman she, weeks earlier, had seen emptying the trash cans. The executives who had laughed at her now looked at her with a mixture of panic and admiration. The rumor of the millionaire inheritance had spread, but the reality of seeing her there, as an equal beside the boss, was something no gossip could prepare them for. The image was too powerful, a complete breakdown of the social order everyone knew. Ignoring the astonished looks, Danilo guided Renata down the hall, past his old office, and stopped in front of the best office on the floor. A corner office, with glass walls and a view of the city that was vacant. He took a key from his pocket and extended it to her in a clear gesture for all to see. "This is your base of operations, if you accept my proposal," he said in a loud, clear voice. "Welcome back, Dr. Silva." That doctor resonated through the silence, not as a formality, but as a coronation. Renata looked at the key in Danilo's hand. It was cold metal, but it felt like it weighed a ton, laden with the weight of two realities. One was the life she had dreamed of in recent days, a quiet house, security for Beatrice, the founding of her own small consulting firm, far from that building and its painful memories. The other reality was there, in that glass room, a platform of power and influence she never imagined possessing. It was the chance not only to remake her life, but to redefine the rules of the game for hundreds of other people. The professor inside her, the woman who believed in transformation through knowledge and ethics, screamed louder than the wounded woman who just wanted peace. With a slow, deliberate gesture, she took the key from his hand. The entire office seemed to exhale the breath it had been holding. "I accept," she said, her voice echoing with a new authority. "But with a few conditions." Danilo nodded, ready to hear anything. "The first," Renata continued, turning to the audience of employees, "is that from today, this company's bonus and evaluation policy will be tied not only to financial goals, but also to an evaluation of ethics and collaboration. The second is that I want Mrs. Lucia from the pantry in my office in 5 minutes. I insist that the first coffee I have in this office be served by her, so that I can personally thank her for every one of the smiles and words of comfort she gave me when I was invisible to everyone else. Renata's order was a declaration of principles, a cultural earthquake that shook the foundations of Sousa and Associados. It was not a quest for revenge, but an act of poetic justice that elevated the forgotten. Danilo, far from feeling challenged, felt a wave of admiration. "Excellent," he declared loudly for all to hear. "The HR department has new guidelines from now on, and Carla, please escort Mrs. Lucia to Dr. Silva's office." That day marked the beginning of a new era. Employees who once averted their gaze from Renata now greeted her with a fearful respect that would quickly turn into admiration. She didn't lock herself in her glass fortress. Instead, she spent the day talking to department heads and junior analysts, listening, learning, diagnosing the company with the same precision with which she had translated the Hungarian documents. At the end of the afternoon, sitting in her new chair, she watched the sunset paint the city's skyscrapers. On her desk lay the signed contract and the confirmation of her fortune, but her gaze was focused on a notebook where she was already drawing organizational charts and projects. The inheritance saved her, the money gave her freedom. But it was this, the work, the chance to build, to lead with purpose, that made her feel, finally, at home. A year passed. Sousa and Associados was unrecognizable and paradoxically more successful than ever. The international consulting division, under the presidency of Renata Silva, became the jewel in the company's crown, attracting global clients who sought not just profit, but security and cultural intelligence. Renata's name became synonymous with integrity and brilliance in the market. Reports in business magazines told her unlikely story, omitting the most humiliating details but celebrating her meteoric rise. The company's culture changed radically. Ethical evaluations became as important as sales targets, and collaboration replaced predatory competition. Mrs. Lucia, the pantry lady, now supervised a new employee wellness program, a Renata initiative. But the greatest trophy of her victory was not in the corporate world. It was in her new house, a beautiful residence with a huge garden where Beatrice, her daughter, now ran with a golden retriever named Bator, which means brave in Hungarian. Renata came home every day in time for dinner, to help with homework, to simply be a mother. The fortune gave her security, the job gave her purpose, but seeing her daughter's quiet happiness, free from the shadows of worry, was her true inheritance. Danilo was also a transformed man. He learned to lead not by fear, but by respect. His meetings with Renata were the high point of his week, an intellectual duel between partners who deeply admired each other. He was lighter, happier, and discovered that the weight of tyranny was far more exhausting than the challenge of collaboration. But the most profound change was not seen in the company's corridors, but in an act that sealed his redemption. On a spring afternoon, he visited the university campus from which Renata had been expelled. At a press conference, alongside a visibly emotional Renata, he announced the creation of the Silva Kovacs Foundation. With an initial endowment of 10 million euros from his inheritance, the foundation had a dual purpose: to provide scholarships for linguistics and international relations, and more importantly, to offer legal and financial support to academics and employees who reported corruption schemes in their institutions. He was using his uncle's money to build a shield for all future Renatas, ensuring that no other brilliant mind would be silenced by injustice. It was the perfect closing of the cycle, transforming his unexpected fortune into a weapon against the very evil that started this whole journey. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, the garden of Renata's house was full of life and laughter. It was a scene that defied any logic of the past. Beatrice ran on the grass with Bator, the dog, while Donna Lucia, elegant in a linen dress, chatted animatedly in a makeshift portuñol with Dr. Varga, the Hungarian lawyer who had come to Brazil for the foundation's launch ceremony. In a corner near the barbecue pit, Danilo Souza, wearing a polo shirt and an apron, struggled not to burn the picanha, receiving humorous instructions from the husband of Carla, his secretary. He was no longer the boss there. He was just Danilo, the friend who didn't know how to barbecue. Renata watched everything from the porch, a glass of wine in her hand, her heart overflowing with a peace she never thought possible. Danilo approached her, handing her a piece of grilled cheese. "Looking at all this," he said, following her gaze, "who would have thought that a pile of papers in Hungarian could fix so many lives, starting with mine?" Renata smiled, a wise and serene smile. "It wasn't the papers, Danilo. It was a lesson about the value of people. Sometimes fate hands us a test in a language we don't understand, just to force us to find the right translator." And so, Renata Silva's story ceased to be about humiliation and became a tale about the true meaning of value. It proved that a person's dignity is not in the position they hold or the clothes they wear, but in the strength of their character and the richness of their mind. Her and Danilo's journey showed that arrogance is the most dangerous of blindnesses and that humility is the only lens capable of correcting it. It showed that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing an army, but simply taking a step forward when everyone expects you to retreat and speaking your truth in whatever language is necessary. Renata's final victory was not the fortune nor the office with a city view. It was that noisy garden, full of people from different worlds, united by respect and friendship. It was the sound of her daughter's laughter, free and safe. It was the living proof that a single person, armed with knowledge and courage, can, in fact, turn the world upside down and put it back in the right place.